I had always loved traveling, finding new places to explore, and indulging in a few days away from the hustle of daily life. When my friend Liz suggested an Airbnb getaway in the countryside for a weekend, I was thrilled. The plan was simple: 2 days of peace, quiet, and fresh air at a cozy house in Cedar Hill, a small town tucked away in the mountains. It sounded perfect, but if I had known what was waiting for us there, I never would have agreed to go. We found the listing online. The photos showed a charming, old farmhouse with a wide porch, white picket fences, and sprawling fields that stretched out to the tree line. The reviews were all glowing, with visitors raving about the scenic beauty, the comfort of the house, and how magical the place felt. That last bit stuck with me, but I brushed it off, thinking they were just talking about the peaceful atmosphere. Liz and I booked it right away. The owner, a woman named Martha, was friendly and accommodating, sending us all the details and instructions for checking in. She seemed like a sweet old lady, and everything felt just right. We left early on a Friday afternoon, eager to beat the evening rush and enjoy as much daylight as we could. The drive up was smooth, winding through scenic roads that climbed higher and higher into the mountains. As we approached Cedar Hill, the landscape became even more beautiful: green hills, dense forests, and clear skies. I felt my stress melt away with each passing mile. When we finally arrived, the house looked just as it had in the pictures. It was a classic 2-story farmhouse, probably built in the early 1900s, with white clapboard siding and dark green shutters. The porch wrapped around the front of the house, offering a view of the fields and distant woods. It was quaint and picturesque, like something out of a postcard. Liz was just as impressed as I was. We unloaded our bags and made our way up to the front door. The key was hidden under a potted plant, just like Martha had said. We stepped inside and immediately felt at home. The interior was cozy and well kept, with old wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and antique decorations that gave the place character. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and the kitchen had that rustic charm you'd expect from a country home. It was exactly what we had hoped for: peaceful and inviting. We spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking our things, and exploring the house. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, each with its own unique charm, but we both chose rooms that faced the backyard, where the view was the most serene. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fields, we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, enjoying the quiet. That's when things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a strange sensation, like we weren't alone. Liz mentioned it before I did, laughing nervously as she said, "Do you ever get that feeling like someone's watching you?" I smiled, trying to brush it off. It's just the isolation. We're not used to being this far away from people. She nodded but didn't look convinced. Yeah, maybe. We finished our wine and headed inside to make dinner. I was stirring a pot on the stove when I heard footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought Liz had gone up to grab something from her room, but then I saw her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. I froze. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully down the hall. Liz noticed the change in my expression and looked up. "What is it?" she asked, setting her phone down. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. We both fell silent, and there it was again, soft, creaking footsteps coming from upstairs. Liz stood up, her face pale. Maybe it's the house settling. I wasn't so sure. The sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. My heart pounded as we both stood there, listening. The footsteps stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. "Maybe we should check it out," Liz suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I hesitated, but nodded. We grabbed our phones and headed for the stairs, moving as quietly as we could. The old wooden steps creaked under our weight, and with each one, I felt my nerves stretch tighter. We reached the top of the stairs and paused, listening. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms all slightly ajar. I walked toward my room, Liz right behind me, and pushed the door open all the way. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My suitcase by the bed, clothes still neatly folded. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. But there was an oppressive heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere had shifted. Liz checked her room, and it was the same. Nothing out of place, no sign of anyone else. We looked at each other, both of us clearly spooked, but trying to stay calm. "It was probably nothing," Liz said, though her voice wavered. "Maybe it was just the wind," but I wasn't convinced. As we headed back downstairs, the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though we both remained on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows made us jump. We tried to distract ourselves by watching a movie, but the feeling of being watched never really went away. By the time we went to bed, I was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. My mind raced with thoughts of those footsteps and the strange energy that seemed to hang over the house. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud thud. My heart jumped into my throat as I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The house was dark and still, but there was a faint noise, like something scraping against the floor. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands trembling. Slowly, I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was pitch black, the only light coming from my phone. I stepped out, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept toward Liz's room. Before I could knock, the door swung open, and Liz stood there, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. "What was it?" "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. It sounded like it came from downstairs. We exchanged a nervous glance, neither of us wanting to be the one to go check. But we both knew we couldn't ignore it. We made our way down the stairs together, moving as quietly as we could. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I kept the flashlight trained on the floor, illuminating the path ahead. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. The living room furniture had been moved. The coffee table was pushed against the far wall, and the chairs were scattered around the room, as if someone, or something, had been here. Liz gasped, grabbing my arm. "What the hell?" I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way we had done this. We hadn't touched the furniture since we arrived. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something darted across the room, too fast to be human. I whipped the flashlight in the direction of the movement, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Liz nodded, her face pale. "What was it?" Before I could answer, the scraping sound started again. It was coming from the kitchen. We slowly approached the doorway, our hearts pounding in our chests. I shone the flashlight into the kitchen, and there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as the light hit it, I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and translucent, like it had been drained of all life. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light. Liz let out a choked scream, and the thing turned its head toward us. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in fear, but suddenly, the thing vanished, just blinked out of existence, leaving us standing in the darkness. Without a word, Liz and I bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were in the car, speeding down the highway away from Cedar Hill. We never went back to that Airbnb. When I tried to contact Martha, the owner, her listing had disappeared, and all her contact information was gone. It was as if she and the house had never existed. But I know what I saw. That thing, whatever it was, is still out there. And I'll never forget the way it looked at us, with those hollow, empty eyes. I've always been a fan of spontaneous trips. There's something about the thrill of packing up and heading somewhere new without much planning that excites me. So when my girlfriend, Emma, suggested we escape the city for a long weekend, I immediately hopped online to find us a minute Airbnb rental. After scrolling through countless listings, I found what looked like the perfect spot. A quaint little cabin in a place called Maple Grove. The photos showed a cozy log cabin nestled in the woods, complete with a fire pit and a small lake nearby. It looked like paradise. The reviews were mostly positive, though a couple of them mentioned some strange experiences at the property, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The price was right, the location was ideal, and the cabin was available for our dates. I booked it without a second thought. We left early Friday morning, the excitement of a quiet weekend away pushing all thoughts of work and city life to the back of our minds. The drive was long, but the scenic roads made it enjoyable. The closer we got to Maple Grove, the denser the trees became, their tall trunks and thick branches forming a canopy over the road. It felt like we were entering another world, far from civilization. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The cabin looked just as it had in the photos, small, rustic, and surrounded by towering trees. It was secluded, which was exactly what we wanted. There were no neighbors in sight, just the vast expanse of woods and the distant glimmer of the lake. "This is perfect," Emma said, smiling as we got out of the car. "So peaceful," I agreed. It was the kind of place you could unwind and forget about the rest of the world. We unloaded our bags and headed inside. The interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace, a plush couch, and wooden beams running across the ceiling. It had a cabin in the woods charm, with just the right amount of modern amenities to keep it comfortable. There were 2 bedrooms, but we only needed one, so we tossed our bags into the master bedroom at the back of the house. The room had a large window that looked out into the woods, and the view was stunning. I could already picture us sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset. After we settled in, Emma suggested we take a walk down to the lake before it got too dark. We grabbed our jackets and headed outside, following a narrow path that wound through the trees. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was serene. The lake was even more beautiful up close. The water was still, reflecting the colors of the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. We stood there for a while, taking in the peaceful surroundings, before deciding to head back to the cabin. That's when things started to get strange. As we walked back along the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that made me glance over my shoulder every few steps. Emma must have noticed the change in my demeanor because she asked, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just a little tired, I guess." She didn't seem convinced but let it go. We reached the cabin just as the last light of day faded, and the sky turned a deep shade of purple. Inside, the air was warm and inviting, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease a little. We spent the rest of the evening making dinner and relaxing by the fireplace, enjoying the quiet, but that feeling of being watched never completely left me. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me awake, but as I lay there in the darkness, I realized that the cabin was completely silent. No creaking of the floorboards, no wind against the windows, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. I listened for a moment, my heart beating faster. Then, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from outside the window. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, straining to hear. It was so soft, like someone gently knocking on the glass. But we were in the middle of the woods. Who would be out there? Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the room. But beyond that, I couldn't see anything. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Just as I was about to close my eyes and try to fall back asleep, there was a sudden, loud thump against the window. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up in bed, my eyes wide. Emma stirred beside me, mumbling something incoherent before rolling over. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond, already slipping back into sleep. I sat there, listening, my body tense. The silence returned, but the air in the room felt different, heavier. It was as if something was out there, just beyond the window, watching us. I wanted to get up and check, but a part of me was too scared to move. I didn't want to know what was out there. After what felt like an eternity, I finally lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it was filled with strange, unsettling dreams. The next morning, I told Emma about the noises I had heard, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just an animal. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. We spent the day exploring the nearby town of Maple Grove, which was small but charming, with a couple of shops and a diner that served surprisingly good food. The day passed uneventfully, and by the time we returned to the cabin, I had almost convinced myself that the strange noises from the night before had been nothing. That night, however, things took a darker turn. It started with the lights. We were sitting in the living room, watching a movie, when the lights began to flicker. At first, it was just a slight dimming, like a power surge, but then... The moment I stepped into the driveway of the Sycamore Hills Airbnb, a chill crawled up my spine. The house itself was a grand old Victorian, painted in shades of pale blue and white with towering gables and ornate trimmings. It was exactly the kind of place my husband, Aaron would fall in love with, full of history and character. He was always the one for unique stays, and when he found this gem for our getaway, he booked it without hesitation. As we unloaded our bags from the car, the air around us felt thick, like it was pressing in on us. The summer heat hung heavy in the air, but there was something else, a tension, a stillness, that made me uneasy. "Look at this place, Megan," Aaron said, beaming as he gestured to the grand house. "It's like something out of a novel." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at my stomach. "Yeah, it's ... something." I didn't want to spoil his excitement. Aaron had been working long hours lately, and this trip was supposed to be our chance to reconnect and relax. I kept telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place that was making me feel off. We'd rented Airbnbs before, and they'd always been fine. This would be no different. We grabbed our bags and headed inside. The house was even more impressive on the inside. High ceilings, intricate woodwork, and vintage furniture that looked like it had been plucked from the early 1900s. The wooden floorboards creaked under our feet as we explored. The living room was spacious, with an oversized fireplace and large windows that looked out onto a sprawling garden in the back. There was a library on the first floor, filled with shelves of old leather-bound books. Aaron was immediately drawn to it, running his fingers along the spines of the books like they were treasures waiting to be uncovered. "Check this out," Aaron called from the other room. I followed the sound of his voice and found him standing in front of an old oil painting that hung over the fireplace in the dining room. It was a portrait of a woman in a dark dress, her face expressionless as she stared out from the frame. "That's creepy," I muttered, my eyes locked on the woman's cold gaze. Aaron chuckled. "It's just a painting. Adds to the charm, don't you think?" "I guess," I said, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's eyes were following us as we moved around the room. We settled into the house, unpacking and getting comfortable. Aaron made us a light dinner, and we sat on the back porch as the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden. It should have been peaceful, but that strange tension I'd felt when we arrived hadn't left me. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger as the evening wore on. That night, after we'd gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had roused me, but as I lay there, blinking in the darkness, I realized that the room was freezing cold. I reached for the blankets, pulling them up to my chin, but the chill seemed to seep through the fabric. I glanced over at Aaron, who was still sound asleep beside me. The room was eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere down the hall. I tried to close my eyes and drift back to sleep, but just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking coming from the hallway outside our room. Creak ... creak ... creak. My heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like someone slowly walking up and down the hall outside our door. I turned to Aaron and shook his shoulder. "Aaron, wake up," he grumbled, half asleep. "What's wrong?" "Listen," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, turning over and rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Just as I was about to answer, the creaking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I held my breath, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. Aaron yawned, clearly unimpressed. "It's probably just the house settling, Meg. These old places make noise. Go back to sleep." I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound had been too deliberate, too ... human. I lay back down. but it took me a long time to fall asleep, my mind racing with uneasy thoughts. The next morning, I tried to shake off the lingering sense of dread, convincing myself that Aaron was right. It was just the house settling. We spent the day exploring the nearby town, which was quaint and charming, full of little antique shops and cafes. Aaron was in his element, wandering through stores and chatting with the locals, while I tried to focus on enjoying the trip. But when we returned to the house that afternoon, the unease returned with full force. We had planned to spend the evening relaxing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. While Aaron was in the library, I wandered through the house, trying to figure out why it made me so uneasy. Every room seemed to hum with an undercurrent of energy, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I walked down the hallway near our bedroom, I stopped in front of a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached for the handle, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led up to what I assumed was the attic. A cold draft blew down the stairs, and I shivered. "Meg, what are you doing?" Aaron's voice called from down the hall. I jumped, startled. "Oh, nothing," I said quickly, closing the door and stepping away. "Just looking around. Come on, I found something cool in the library," he said. I followed him, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me again. That night, the noises started up again, creaking footsteps in the hallway, faint whispers that seemed to echo through the walls. Every time I woke up, I felt like there was something just outside the door, watching, waiting. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. On the third night, things escalated. It was well past midnight, and the house was dead silent. I had finally managed to fall asleep when I was jolted awake by a loud crash from downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening. Aaron was already awake beside me. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. We got out of bed and made our way downstairs, the floorboards creaking under our feet. As we reached the living room, I froze. The painting of the woman over the fireplace was lying face down on the floor, the frame cracked and splintered. But that wasn't what scared me the most. In the dust on the floor, just beneath where the painting had hung, were footprints. Small, bare footprints, like those of a child, leading away from the fireplace and disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city and spend a weekend at a secluded Airbnb. Hollow Creek was the perfect spot, a cabin deep in the woods, far from any civilization. I booked it without hesitation, imagining a peaceful weekend filled with long hikes, reading, and maybe even some stargazing. I needed the break, and after reading dozens of glowing reviews, I was convinced that this place would offer the tranquility I craved. The drive up was long and winding, the kind of route where your phone eventually loses signal and you're left with nothing but your thoughts and the quiet hum of the car. As I got closer to the cabin, the trees grew denser, towering over the narrow dirt road. The sense of isolation was palpable, but it was exactly what I had wanted. I pulled up in front of the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of orange and gold. The cabin itself was charming, with its wooden exterior and wraparound porch. It looked old but well maintained, nestled at the edge of the woods with a small creek running just behind it. There was something serene about the sound of the water trickling over rocks, a natural melody that immediately calmed my nerves. I stepped out of the car, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp, cool air. A sense of peace washed over me as I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The key had been left under a rock, just as the host, a man named Thomas, had instructed. The moment I opened the door, the cabin greeted me with the smell of pine and the faint scent of wood smoke. It felt lived in, like it had stories hidden in its walls. The interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace dominating one side of the room and a large, overstuffed couch positioned in front of it. A bookshelf lined the far wall, filled with old, dog-eared books. The kitchen was small but functional, and a narrow staircase led up to the loft where the bedroom was located. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things and lighting a fire in the hearth. The sun had fully set by then, leaving the woods outside shrouded in darkness. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was perfect. I spent the next couple of hours relaxing with a book and a glass of wine, the warmth of the fire making me drowsy. By the time I headed up to bed, I was in a state of blissful contentment. The bedroom in the loft was small but cozy, with a large window that offered a view of the creek and the trees beyond. I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt up around me, and drifted off to sleep with ease. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The fire downstairs had long since died, and the cabin was silent except for the soft sound of the creek outside. I lay there for a moment, my mind still foggy with sleep, when I heard it, a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. It had come from downstairs. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or the wind pushing against the walls. But as I strained to listen, I heard it again. Creak. It was unmistakable this time, and it wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was downstairs. My mind raced, grasping for a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten in, I thought. A raccoon, maybe, or some other small creature. But even as I tried to calm myself, I knew it didn't make sense. The doors were locked, and I had made sure to close all the windows before going to bed. I slowly sat up, my body tense, and glanced around the dark room. The cabin was old, so it was possible that the sounds were just the result of its age. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Another creak. This time, it was followed by a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps moving slowly across the wooden floor. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the room just enough for me to see. I hadn't bothered to check for cell service earlier, and now, as I glanced at the screen, I saw that I had none. Of course, I cursed under my breath. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the living room to the other. I couldn't just stay up there, frozen in fear, but the thought of going downstairs sent a wave of panic through me. What if someone had broken in? What if there was someone in the cabin right now? I tried to think rationally. If there was an intruder, they would have heard me by now. The loft wasn't exactly soundproof, and my movements would have given me away. But whoever, or whatever, was downstairs didn't seem to care. The footsteps continued, pausing occasionally, as if the person was inspecting something. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for the worst. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, careful to avoid making any noise. I crept toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached the top of the staircase, I peered down into the dark living room. The fire had died completely, leaving the room in near total darkness. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes or movement, but all I could see were the faint outlines of the furniture. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, but this time they were louder and closer, directly beneath me. My blood turned to ice as I realized that whatever was down there was standing right at the foot of the stairs. I held my breath, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, in the darkness, I heard a soft, ragged breathing, slow and steady, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. I couldn't take it any more. I backed away from the stairs, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. My only option was to make a run for the door, but that meant going downstairs, going toward whatever was down there. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself for what I had to do. My heart raced as I moved back toward the stairs, my steps as silent as I could make them. I paused at the top, listening intently. The breathing had stopped, and the living room was eerily quiet again. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I bolted down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, as I raced for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity before it finally clicked open. I threw the door open and ran out into the night, not stopping until I was halfway to my car. I stood there, panting, my breath forming clouds in the cold night air. The cabin loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't care. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. As I drove down the winding dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the cabin's doorway, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the dark silhouette of the cabin, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small motel and checked in for the night. I spent the rest of the evening trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe the sounds were just the cabin settling, like old houses do. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something or someone had been in that cabin with me. And whatever it wasn't human. I never went back to Hollow Creek. I left a brief message for Thomas the next morning, explaining that I had to leave early due to a family emergency. He didn't question it, and I never mentioned what had happened. I didn't want to know if anyone else had experienced the same thing. All I know is that I will never book a secluded Airbnb again. I had heard so many great things about Willow Ridge. Tucked away in the scenic hills of Vermont, this Airbnb was highly rated for its stunning views, its peaceful atmosphere, and its charming, vintage architecture. After a stressful few months at work, I decided it was time to take a break, and Willow Ridge seemed like the perfect escape. The host, Emily, was highly regarded in the reviews, praised for her attentiveness and the thoughtful little touches she left for her guests. I arrived at the house just as dusk was settling. The late summer sun bathed the hills in a warm golden light, and the gravel driveway crunched under the tires of my car as I pulled up in front of the large, two-story house. It was an old farmhouse, probably built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and it looked like it had been meticulously restored. A large porch wrapped around the front, and ivy clung to the sides of the house, giving it an even older, almost Gothic look. I stepped out of the car and stretched, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to melt away as I took in the peaceful surroundings. There wasn't another house in sight, just rolling hills and dense woods. It was exactly what I needed. Grabbing my bags, I made my way to the front door and let myself in with the key that Emily had left in a lockbox. Inside, the house was just as charming as the photos had promised. The floors creaked underfoot as I walked through the large, open living room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and vintage furniture was arranged in a way that felt both stylish and comfortable. The kitchen was quaint but fully equipped, with a wooden farmhouse table sitting in the center of the room. The whole house had a welcoming, lived-in feel. Emily had left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, welcoming me to Willow Ridge and letting me know that if I needed anything, she was just a phone call away. She also mentioned that the nearest town was about a 20-minute drive, and that the house was stocked with all the essentials. I smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for her thoughtfulness, and set my bags down in the hallway. I decided to explore the house before settling. The ground floor had a cozy study filled with books, a dining room with a massive oak table, and a screened-in porch overlooking the backyard. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, each more charming than the last. I chose the largest room, which had a king-sized bed, a clawfoot bathtub, and a window that offered a spectacular view of the rolling hills. After unpacking and changing into something more comfortable, I made myself a cup of tea and took it out to the porch. The sun had almost completely set by now, and the sky was painted with hues of pink and purple. I sat in one of the old wicker chairs, sipping my tea and letting the stillness of the place wash over me. It was so quiet, so peaceful. As night fell, I decided to head inside and relax with a book. I curled up in front of the fireplace, the only sound the crackling of the logs as they burned. I felt a deep sense of contentment, the kind you only get when you're far away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It must have been close to midnight when I decided to head up to bed. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I heard something, a soft thudding sound, almost like someone walking down the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, my toothbrush still in my hand, and listened intently. Thud, thud, thud. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. My heart began to race. I was the only one in the house. Or at least, I was supposed to be. I cautiously stepped out of the bathroom and into the bedroom, my eyes darting to the door. The hallway was dark, but the soft thud of footsteps continued. They stopped right outside my door. For a moment, I stood there, completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the old house was just settling. But then, the doorknob slowly began to turn. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The knob twisted back and forth, as if someone on the other side was trying to open the door. But it was locked, and after a few moments, the turning stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, trembling and sure of what to do. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked for service. Of course, there was none. The house was too far out in the country to get a reliable signal. I cursed under my breath and glanced toward the door, half expecting it to swing open. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to approach the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening intently, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no sound of breathing, just silence. Slowly, I unlocked the door and pulled it open, peering into the dark hallway. It was empty. I exhaled, the tension in my body releasing just a little. Maybe it had been my imagination after all. Maybe the old house had creaked in just the right way to sound like footsteps. But as I turned to head back to bed, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just outside one of the other bedrooms, stood a figure. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its body was shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of a person standing perfectly still. A cold wave of fear washed over me. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, or at least, I assumed it was watching me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze. I slowly backed into my room, not daring to take my eyes off the figure. As I did, it began to move slowly, deliberately, taking one step after another toward me. Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. For the next few minutes, I stood there, pressing my back against the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps in the hallway stopped again, just outside my room, but this time, the doorknob didn't turn. There was only silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the bed, my phone clutched in my hands, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but the figure didn't return. Eventually, the sun began to rise, casting pale light through the window, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. As soon as it was light enough, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother to call Emily, didn't leave a note. I just got in my car and drove as fast as I could, my heart still racing from the events of the night before. I never figured out who, or what, that figure was. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it must have been a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something, someone, in that house with me. When I finally got back home, I did a little research. Willow Ridge had been in Emily's family for generations, and as I dug deeper, I found an old newspaper article from the 1920s about a man who had disappeared while staying there. He was last seen checking into the farmhouse, but no one ever saw him leave. The locals called him the forgotten guest, and his body was never found. I haven't been back to Willow Ridge since, and I don't plan to. No matter how beautiful the view or how peaceful the surroundings, there's something dark in that house, and I'm not willing to find out what it is. I still wonder, though, who, or what, was standing in that hallway, watching me as I slept. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in my mind.